Hello, everybody. As we make our way through the second half of the semester, I hope everybody's doing well. I'm delighted to get to share with you a little bit today about the poetry of Virgil as we continue our discussion of Rome and Roman culture. In recent years, people who think and write about culture have been engaged in kind of an ongoing debate about the relationship between art and politics. And so even a quick glimpse of a variety of media will yield such headlines as why art is by definition political. Art is not inherently political. Liberals are killing art by insisting that it's always political. And is political art the only art that matters now? It seems that hardly a week goes by without a comment on a new book or movie or TV show or song that ventures into the realm of political controversy or some hot button issue. Some people roundly praise artists for their courage, and others lament the fact that even their local movie theater has become a context where they actually have to think about tough questions like corruption, justice, terrorism, racism, and others. Now, while you may have your own opinions about the place of art in politics or the influence of politics on art, it's important to note that while the internet might abound with these kinds of discussions, with these rants and op-eds and articles, many of which were published in the last decade or so, the issues that these pieces address, the topics that these pieces engage with, aren't exactly new. You've already spent several weeks studying ancient cultures, and you've already encountered works like the Enuma Elish and the Hammurabi Stela and Antigone. So you know that artistic expression and political power have demonstrated this close and sometimes uneasy relationship as far back as we know. In so many times and so many places, the artist, as a public figure, can't help but be engaged in the political life of his or her time in some way, some shape, some form. And this is a reality that leads to all different kinds of political expressions from artists from all different kinds of political leanings. So for every piece of art that gives hope to the oppressed or brings to the forefront some crucial and difficult issue, there's another artist who might be all too willing to engage in propaganda on behalf of the powers that be. And so in many cases, the question isn't whether art is political, or whether art should be political. That is, whether art is bound up in the culture and the political movements, the political activity of its time, life and community with others. But what forms this relationship between art and politics might take? How is art engaged with the politics of its time? How is art engaged with the cultural life and the wider social order of its time? Well, this week, as we continue our exploration of ancient Roman culture, we're going to be talking about Roman literature. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Augustan literature. Now, it's important here at the outset to note that there are actually two periods in the history of literature that are classified as Augustan. The first one is the one that we'll be talking about today. It refers to the flourishing of literature, primarily poetry, that took place during the time leading up to and including the reign of Octavian, or Caesar Augustus, as the princeps of Rome. You've been discussing Octavian's rise to power. You've been discussing the establishment of the Principate in section. But today I'll be engaging with some of the ways that rise to power and the influence that Octavian, Caesar Augustus, sought to exercise over several aspects of Roman culture, the ways that this was bound up with the literature of that time. Specifically, the literature of one of the most prominent Augustan poets, Virgil. Dr. Blumen's lecture, which we'll also be watching this week, will engage primarily with another of the major literary figures of this period, Ovid. Now, I'll say there is a later period in British literature, which we won't be talking about, British literature in the 18th century, and it also goes by the name Augustan. And this is because the poets of that period, such as Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, were self-consciously imitating some of the conventions. They were embracing some of the ideals that they saw in the poetry of Augustan Rome. So that gives us some idea of Augustus's enormous influence on literature. Most rulers, most political figures don't even get one period named after them, but Augustus had two. So as we begin to reflect on the influence that a leader like Augustus would have had on the literature of Rome, we want to start by looking at one of the central qualities of Roman literary culture. In fact, it's an important trait of Roman culture in general, stretching all the way back to the time of the Republic. And that's the characteristic of patronage. You've already read briefly and discussed in section about the role that the patron-client relationship played in the early days of Roman society. A wealthy, well-connected individual would enter into a mutually beneficial agreement with a client or a number of clients. This patron would provide kindnesses to those people, either by giving them material goods or by helping them acquire social capital, such as employment, in finding desirable positions, or maybe getting them out of a jam when they needed it. The client, in turn, would offer support, loyalty, and service to the powerful person that he or she was attached to. As one scholar has said of this system, it was the cement that bound Republican society. So this idea of patronage was one that had a long and respected history in Rome. And even when the Republic was replaced by a new form of government, the Principate, this idea persisted. So you could still find men who had achieved a certain position of wealth and power who wanted to use that position to help others find their place in society. And among these, a number of patrons were particularly interested in the cultural life of Rome. They sought to advance promising young artists, especially poets, in their careers. Now, it's important to remember that the literary culture of Rome was very different from what we're used to seeing. This was before the printing press. This was before the mass production of texts. It was before film versions of novels, before agents and publishing companies, and all of the other elements that make it possible, if not difficult, for a writer to make a living off of his or her craft. So if a poet wanted to benefit in any kind of material way from writing, he would be dependent on the generosity of a patron. In some cases, a patron might give a writer whose work he admired a post of some sort, kind of a day job that would pay a little bit of money so that the poet would have time to write. In other cases, the kindnesses of the patron could be even more lucrative. There's evidence that some Roman poets were granted large estates by patrons who wanted to do something very generous to honor the artist's talent. But even beyond material gifts, even beyond financial gifts, the patrons would also introduce the poet to other influential people, to his circle of friends, so that the writer would have a network of people who would listen to his work and publicize the poet's greatness. And in return for all this support, what could the patron expect to get for himself? Well, this is where things get interesting. For some wealthy patrons, it was exciting simply to be in a position where you could have smart, talented people for friends. Part of the thrill in being a patron to an artistic client was getting to hang out with someone whose work you admired. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle observed that well-off people might not need much in life, but he says they do enjoy having witty companions. This was a need, this was an enjoyment that was met in this patron-client relationship between wealthy members of society and the artists that they patronized. In other cases, these patrons valued their relationship with poets because they knew that the poets could make them famous by including them in their poems. Some patrons imagined that long after they were dead, future generations would see their names preserved in the works written by the poets that they kept in their circle. So in this way, a poet could make his patron immortal. But even before they were dead, these patrons understood that a talented writer could make their name known, could make their name celebrated among other important people. So a poet, if he were so inclined, could function as a kind of public relations man for a patron who might have more money than he knew what to do with, but who also wanted to be spoken well of. The patronage system, while it came to be simply a part of the literary culture of ancient Rome, posed a couple of challenges for the poet. First, serious poets had to retain some measure of credibility, so they couldn't be seen to be too enthusiastic in their praise of their patrons, or else they'd be accused of courting the favor of a wealthy individual at the expense of their art. In today's language, we would say that these poets were selling out. To take one example of this, we have a poem from an anonymous poet to a well-known patron named Messala. And the poem includes these opening lines. He says, "Let me sing of you, Messala, though your acknowledged valor holds me in awe. Even if my weak powers may not be able to sustain it, I shall begin. If you should praise my poems by their own merits, they would fail. Let me be merely a recorder of your mighty feats." The poet then goes on to compare Messala, his patron, to legendary heroes like Ulysses and Nestor. He recounts his great exploits on the battlefield. He even makes prophetic proclamations of future victories that Messala will win in Gaul and Spain and even in the Southern Hemisphere. The poet ends by saying that when he dies, he wishes to be reincarnated as a horse, and then as a bull, and then a bird, and finally as a human, so that he can once again sing the praises of Messala. In other words, this poet is laying it on a bit thick. It might be pretty clear that he's trying to hit Messala up for money or land. Now, there's probably a reason why we don't know this poet's name. Messala might have enjoyed this praise for a little while, but even a proud patron would have been able to see through the act and to realize that this poet wasn't actually any good. And so he would have cut this poet loose. If a poet was going to win the favor of a patron and still be seen as a worthy artist, he was going to have to be a bit more subtle. Now, a second challenge for the poet was deciding who to seek patronage from. In the years leading up to the Principate, there were a number of wealthy patrons that might be of service to a poet. Among these were politicians like Gaius Pollio and Maecenas, and they both supported some of the most accomplished poets of the early Augustan period. Sometimes these well-connected individuals competed with one another for the attention of artists. Sometimes these individuals could go from a position of wealth and power to one of relative disgrace rather quickly. And so it wouldn't do a poet much good to be connected to someone who was about to experience a negative turn, a reversal of fortune. So it was important not to make the wrong alliances. Poets who wanted to seek patronage might have to play the field with a certain level of shrewdness. They might have to pick and choose their patrons carefully. However, after the Battle of Actium, when Antony was decisively defeated, this battle that you read about in section yesterday, when the second triumvirate collapsed, when it became clear that Octavian was going to be the undisputed ruler of Rome, there really wasn't much room for other patrons. Even in cases where other individuals with connections to the throne, like Maecenas, continued to support poets, it was important to keep in mind that the ultimate patron, the one whose favor mattered more than anyone else's, was Caesar Augustus himself. And if poets saw that obtaining the favor of Augustus would be favorable to their career, it also became clear to Augustus and to his closest advisors that bringing poets into their sphere of influence through patronage could benefit the Principate as well. Now, Augustus, as you'll learn over the next couple of weeks, was someone who was very invested in getting his message, his agenda, the values that he wanted to promote out there. Today, when politicians want to promote their message, it's obvious what they do. They dash off a tweet. Sadly, however, Rome in the first century did not have Twitter, so Augustus had to craft his image in other ways. And he realized shrewdly that cultivating relationships with artists, sculptors, architects, and poets was a good way to shape his image. So with all of that context in mind, let's talk briefly about one of the most famous Augustan poets and reflect on how he fit into his time and place. I'm talking, of course, about Virgil. Virgil was born in 70 BC in a region called Cisalpine Gaul in what is now northern Italy. So if we think about the time that Virgil was born, 70 BCE, we see that he was a young man. He was in his mid-20s when the tumultuous final days of the Republic came to an end in the rise and fall of Julius Caesar. As a lot of writers on Virgil, as a lot of scholars on Virgil have pointed out, this context probably had a great deal to do with how his work took shape. Following Caesar's assassination, when the future of Rome was still very much uncertain, Virgil began writing a series of poems called the Eclogues, and these are his first major works. The word eclogues means something like selections. And when Virgil wrote these works, he was working according to an earlier Greek model. A Greek poet named Theocritus, writing about 200 years before Virgil, had popularized a form of literature known as bucolic poetry. Theocritus used Homeric form. He used the same form that Homer used, but he didn't use it to write about Homeric heroes. He didn't use it to write about the Achilles and the Odysseus of the world. No, he used this form to write about shepherds. It was a way of using simple characters and settings to reflect on the daily activities, the triumphs and trials of the men who worked in the fields. In his own eclogues, Virgil wrote about shepherds, but he also wrote about life in Rome just after the end of the Republic. In some cases, he even alluded to political events that were transpiring. Virgil published the eclogues in 38 BC, and he became a kind of overnight sensation. This new celebrity brought Virgil into the circle of some of the most prominent literary patrons, like Maecenas and Pollio, who would introduce him to Octavian. Over the next several years, Virgil worked on his second major collection of poems, entitled the Georgics. The Georgics was a collection of poems, roughly 2,000 lines long, divided into 4 books. It was about farming, and it reads like a sort of handbook for the soldier who wants to work the land. One of its most famous books primarily focuses on beekeeping. Now, it might strike you as odd that Virgil, this poet who was trying to make his way in the literary world, would spend so much time writing poems about shepherds and farmers. But there are 2 things to keep in mind. First, the Georgics, just like the eclogues, was based on a Greek work. The Georgics was based on Hesiod's Works and Days. This was a work by the Greek poet who had romanticized the agricultural life. Second, and probably more important, in writing about these soldier farmers, Virgil is lifting up the central ideal figure of the Republic, a person like Cincinnatus, someone who loved the land, but would set aside his plow to go fight for the good of Rome before returning to the land to farm. These ideas would have been pretty popular during the time when Virgil was writing, as the Republic had begun to fall apart, right? The leaders are wanting to project the image that they are restoring Rome to its glory days. They're returning Roman society to that noble time before things like political corruption and civil war messed everything up. It's believed that Virgil read selections from these poems directly to Octavian in 30 BC, just after Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide and essentially made Octavian the ruler of the Roman world. One of the passages in Book 3 of the Georgics lays out what Virgil's poetic ambitions for the near future looks like. He writes, "Yet soon I will gird myself to celebrate the fiery flights of Caesar, to make his name live in the future." So Virgil makes it clear he wants to use his poetry to elevate the name of his most powerful patron, the man who will soon be called Caesar Augustus. And to do so, he's going to turn his talents to the most important genre of poetry in the ancient world, the epic. So having published 2 major works in 2 different genres, remains for Virgil to try his hand at the real prize, an epic, kind of like the ones that Homer had written. And given the time period and the connections that he had, especially his connection with the new ruler of Rome, Octavian, Caesar Augustus, everything was setting up nicely for Virgil to write the great epic of Roman history. And so in 27 BC, Virgil began work on an epic in the Homeric style that would not only narrate the events of the founding of Rome in all the grandeur that lovers of Homer would expect, but one that would also situate the Julian family, the line of the Caesars, as major players in this legendary history. As if that weren't enough, the Aeneid would also highlight a number of the values that Augustus prioritized in his own program of returning Rome to the glorious days of its Republican past. Aeneas, the hero of the epic, is devoted to the gods. He's devoted to his family. Most of all, he is devoted to the idea of founding a civilization that would one day rule for the benefit of the world. In at least a few spots within the narrative, Virgil makes it clear that his characters are speaking about, even prophesying about, the golden age that he himself is living in, a time when Caesar Augustus is on the throne, a time when Rome is occupying its rightful spot among the people of the world. If we think about Virgil's life, if we think about what he had experienced in his early years, the tumult of the Roman Republic's decline, the drama of both the first and second triumvirates, and then the period of relative stability that he saw unfolding in the wake of Octavian's victory, it makes sense that this is the sort of story he would want to tell about Rome. One that embraced the calm after the storm, one that would narrate the time he was living in as a longed-for moment toward which history had been building. It's hard to argue against this picture of what it means for Virgil to be an Augustan poet, one whose work was bound up intimately with the life and the rule of his most prominent patron, Caesar Augustus. A skilled writer using his gifts to pay tribute to his ruler and to articulate his ruler's vision for Rome. If Virgil weren't such a good poet, it would be fair to say that this could come across as propaganda. As it is, it's safe to say that Virgil was the sort of poet that Caesar Augustus wanted in his corner. When Virgil died in 19 BC, Augustus and the people close to him made sure that his epic was published. This was a move that not only ensured that people would get to read all the wonderful things Virgil wrote about Augustus, but a move that would also make Virgil famous, not just in Rome, but world famous, as the Aeneid became one of the most widely read poems in the ancient world. But if Virgil's influence and his engagement with his own time and place was remarkable, his reach didn't end there. In fact, the afterlife of Virgil is at least as interesting as his life was. Not only was Virgil one of the most celebrated poets of the ancient world, but his reputation in the Middle Ages, especially among Christian readers, persisted far beyond what even his most admiring contemporaries might have imagined. This is due at least in part to the fact that some pretty prominent and important readers of Virgil ascribed something like prophetic qualities to his work. As early as the 4th century, right around the time that Christianity became a legally recognized religion in the Roman Empire, writers and speakers began to draw connections between some lines in Virgil's 4th eclogue and the birth of Jesus, so much that this poem came to be known as the Messianic Eclogue. An excerpt from that poem that was of particular interest to later interpreters is on the screen. I'll read it out loud. Now the last age by Cumae's Sibyl sung has come and gone, and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. Justice returns old Saturn's reign with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. Only do thou at the boy's birth in whom the iron shall cease, the golden race arise, befriend him, chaste Lucina. 'Tis thine own Apollo reigns. And in thy consulate, this glorious age, O Pollio, shall begin, and the months enter on their mighty march. Under thy guidance, whatso tracks remain of our old wickedness, once done away, shall free the earth from never ceasing fear. He shall receive the life of gods, and see heroes with gods commingling, and himself be seen of them, and with his Father's worth reign o'er a world at peace. Now, even though these words could certainly apply to Virgil's feelings of admiration toward Augustus, for example, a number of Christian readers saw in them a foreshadowing of Christ. In a speech entitled The Oration to the Assembly of the Saints, the Roman Emperor Constantine even quoted this 4th eclogue as a prophecy about Christ. Not long after this, the Christian theologian Augustine also referred in his work, The City of God, to Virgil as a prophet of Christ, saying that he spoke truthfully about the birth of Jesus, even if he didn't know what he was saying at the time. By the 11th century, this idea about Virgil being a prophet whose work pointed to the birth of Jesus, whether he knew it or not, was so widespread that it made its appearance in a popular Christmas play that was performed in various towns throughout Europe. In the play, a number of prophets are called forward, from Moses through Isaiah, Daniel, Habakkuk, David, Simeon, Elizabeth, and John the Baptist. And the last figure that is called upon in this play is Virgil. He is asked to give his testimony about Christ, and he says, "Behold, the only Son comes down from heaven." And so in Virgil, as he was read and interpreted throughout the Middle Ages, we see a poet who was believed to have unlocked a vision of a new world that was dawning, a messianic age that he would foretell, but not participate in. And perhaps it's this view of Virgil that leads to his most famous depiction in the Middle Ages, the role that he will play in Dante's Divine Comedy, which most of you will read in Humanities 102. In that Christian epic, Virgil steps out of the shadows to serve as Dante's guide through the horrors of hell and the trials of purgatory, as the 14th century Christian poet narrates his own spiritual journey. It's not surprising that Dante would choose to present Virgil as such a guide between worlds, because in the eyes of many, Virgil was a poet who had himself straddled worlds, as a representative of Augustan Rome who would be embraced as a prophet of a Christian future. Thanks for your attention.